abandoned the family. Great, you know. So she had to take care of him, and so she couldn't get a job, and so she just did what she could to get by. And her house was amazing. It's a typical city property, but it's not maybe 40 feet wide and 120 feet deep. But every square inch of her soil that wasn't, you know, part of the building was planted with something. She had carrots and corn and green beans and you name it. She had everything. She was a miniature farm. And you went into her house, and she literally had, the only furniture she had was a kitchen table with 2 chairs, one cot for her, one cot for her son, and a little 12-inch black and white screen TV. But the place was spotless. It was immaculately kept, and it was like unbelievable. Amazing woman. But again, you know, and we got her brought into church, and the pastor realized that she was a heck of a housekeeper. How are you going to be the housekeeper? And it was great because, you know, the sister would watch her son, who really couldn't take care of himself. The guy from the waist up, he looked like an Olympic athlete. But from the waist down, he was completely, you know, and he had some mental problems too. But it was really interesting. That really killed me though was they had she was getting $100 a month from the government, $100. And this is 40 years ago, but what a lot of money, you know. And then all of a sudden, she's getting $200. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. You know, this is great, you know. And so now she can get dressing for the salad, you know, butter for the bread. I mean, this is great. You know, I can splurge. Then all of a sudden, about 6 months of that, she gets a letter saying, "Oh, sorry, we made a mistake. You should have been getting, and by the way, you owe us $600 now, plus interest." Are you kidding me? That money was gone. I mean, so we went down with her, we worked it out, and, you know, basically raised hell, and, you know, just what's wrong? You send her to 200 because she could use it. But all the welfare cheats in the world, and these are people really doing it right. Talk about really just anyway. But the church is supposed to step in and take care of these kinds of things, and the church has always done that. My grandmother used to have a saying, Uncle Sam and the Catholics, meaning that you look around at this really beautiful public building, it's either Uncle Sam or the Catholics. She had that kind of pride and faith. And you look at it, who builds the hospitals here in St. Louis? They're all Catholic. You've got a Jewish hospital and a Baptist hospital. You used to have a Lutheran hospital, but it's the Catholics. Who has the schools apart from Uncle Sam? It's the Catholics. You know, next to the Vincent de Paul Society. I mean, next to the welfare, I guess, you know, which of course is huge. But who takes care of the poor? It's Vincent de Paul, you know. And even the people we serve in the inner city, they would say, those are the Catholics. Well, if you need help, go to the Catholics. That was always the thing. Because the Catholics going to help you. Which really led to there was sort of I guess an urban legend that the Catholics are all rich, because otherwise they wouldn't be so generous. They couldn't conceive that people would be that generous who weren't multi-millionaires. They said, "No, we really don't have it. You know, we're just generous people." Did you get it working?
We got it.
All right, breakthrough. Okay. Anyway, that's a long explanation of that, but the church has always been that, you know. You know, the way that we described ourselves historically is as a leavening agent. And what leaven does to the loaf, the dough, we do to society. A little bit of leaven and makes the whole society, makes the whole loaf of bread fluffy and desirable and edible and all that stuff. Pardon me, the same way we've always been a minority, but we've always made a huge difference. That when the Catholics show up, you know, things improve. And, you know, it's always been that way. And we're happy to do it. You know, when the Twin Towers fell in 9/11, you know, we lost something like 400 policemen and firemen in St. Louis, or in New York, you know, when the buildings fell. And when they started having the funerals for all these men, it was all Our Lady of Good Counsel, St. Barnabas, St. Peter's, Diocese of Avila, intern of Prague, It was all Catholic. Something like 92% of the people that were killed were Catholics. And it's like, oh my gosh, But you look at all the professions that don't pay much, that have great high personal risk, involve some kinds of hands-on and sometimes disgusting, responsibilities. I'm talking about teachers. I'm talking about nurses. I'm talking about policemen and firemen. I'm talking about soldiers. Vastly disproportionately Catholic. Hugely disproportionately Catholic. I remember, if you remember this happened, right, I think early in Reagan's first term. There was a guy who was coming home from work and lived in Northern Virginia. And this is about 5 or 6 in the morning. And he's driving along. I don't know if you've ever driven in Northern Virginia, but these highways, they're just like strands of spaghetti. Lord knows where they go. I mean, and you need Daniel Boone and a few other people to help you, Hiawatha and Sacagawea to help you find your way through all that. But this guy knew where he's going, and he's driving home in his AMC Pacer. I remember he had a Pacer. And he's driving along. He looks over the Potomac, and there's an airplane. I mean, a big commercial airliner right in the water. He goes, "What? It's not supposed to be there." So he parks his Pacer and runs down to the bank. And he sees there's people trying to get off this thing because it's going out. So he jumps in. And this is like January, and so he jumps in and he paddles over and helps people get off and he brings them to shore and all this kind of stuff. Finally, after about 20, 30 minutes of doing that, the rescue people showed up, and so he figures, I'm drenched, I'm freezing to death. I'm getting back in my Pacer, cranking up the heat, and heading home. And so he does. And so his wife greets him at the door, and he said, "Honey, what happened to you?" "Oh, there was this plane crash, and I tried to help people, and I jumped in, I got killed." Okay. So he goes to bed, And sure enough, 3 hours later, there were all these news camera teams were on the front lawn of their house. The guy was identified, and he's a hero. He said, "Honey, wake up, you're a hero." So they interview the guy, and they asked him, "Where did you learn to do this?" Because apparently he did a really good job of saving people. He said, "Well, the Catholic schools. They teach you to rescue from the Catholic school. What Catholic school did you go to?" No, I mean it wasn't the skill of rescue. It was the idea that I got to do something. I just can't drive by and hope those people turn out okay. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how the whole thing's supposed to go. That liturgy and service all work together, and the church is supposed to be that leavening agent of getting people to come on board. The liturgy, then, is rightly seen as an exercise of the priestly office of Jesus Christ. Yes. He is both priest and victim. He is the one who is sacrificed. He's also the one doing the sacrifice, which makes our worship vastly different from all the sacrifices of the old law. Because the Levitical priesthood, the priesthood that derived from Aaron, brother of Moses, the victim was always something other than the priest himself, an animal of some kind, or even just a libation where you pour out a jug of wine or something else that you sacrifice. You make a holocaust of it, just as an offering to God. But it's always something other than the priest himself. With Christ, he offers himself. In fact, if you ever notice, the very first thing the priest does when he arrives in the sanctuary after genuflecting is he kisses the altar. Do we not show kiss the altar? Yes, we do. The reason why he does that is because not only was Christ the priest of his sacrifice and the victim of his sacrifice, he was also the altar of his sacrifice. And so since the altar is the primary symbol of Christ in the church, even more so than the crucifix, of course the Eucharist trumps all that, but it's more than a sign, it's a sacrament. But the altar gets kissed as a consequence. I think there are a lot of people assume he's just kissing the relics. No, you really aren't. Even if there aren't any relics, which there should be, but sometimes there aren't. Still kiss the altar anyway, because it is the symbol of Christ. Okay. So he is the priest and the victim and the altar. It involves the presentation of man's sanctification under the guise of signs perceptible by the senses, and its accomplishment in ways appropriate to each of these signs. Obviously, the spiritual dimension of the liturgy is the most important thing, but it's communicated through signs, just like the knowledge that you're soaking in right now, listening to me talk, is, it's a spiritual thing, but it's done through words, signs, the things I'm speaking. There's all kinds of ways of communicating through signs. You can use sign language, you can use whatever, something written. But still in all, what is communicated is spiritual, but it's done through physical signs, which is why we like to use a lot of signs in the liturgy that engage all the senses. You have the sound of the words that are spoken and the music that is sung. You've got the sights of the beautiful church and all the statues and decorations and the symbols of Christ that hang around, and the saints that hang around the church. You've got the taste of the Eucharist itself, the bread and the wine. You've got the smell of the incense and the people next to you. No, I mean just the incense. I remember that when I was a kid, you sit in the same spot all the time, don't you? I mean, pretty much you do. There was an old lady. I was 10 years old. No, probably 8 years old. So she's an old lady to me. This woman had to bathe herself in perfume. She really came on strong. And anyway, but that's not exactly. But the incense is supposed to be the smell, and of course the touch. But all the senses are engaged, and Christ communicates himself through all these things. And believe it or not, the incense is supposed to be sweet smelling. That's the theory behind it. A lot of people start coughing. But and I know people who are asthmatics who cannot go to like a funeral at all because of the incense, or be in a church where a lot of incense is used because there's a residual and it just bothers them. But that, the purpose of the incense is to engage in the sense of smell. And it is supposed to be theoretically sweet smelling. But it always kills me, though. It happens every single time. The minute I put the incense on the charcoal, somebody in the back of church starts coughing. Come on, give me a break. It takes a while for it. I think it's all psychosomatic. But, I'm sorry.
Kind of go towards the thing.
See, I told you. Yeah. I like that. But no, it's fun sometimes to watch non-Catholics. Like we had a funeral today. And very few of the people there were Catholic. And it kind of. Anyway, but we engage all the senses, and that Christ, and the sweet smell of the incense is to the sweetness of Christ. In it, full public worship is performed by the mystical body of Jesus Christ, that is, by the head and his members. From this it follows that every liturgical celebration, because it is an action of Christ, the priest, and of his body, which is the church, is a sacred action surpassing all others. Yeah, there is no higher form of worship. This is the completion, the perfection of all the sacrifices of old. This is the perfect sacrifice commanded by Christ himself, given to us by the Father himself. And you just can't top this. There's no other way you can top this. You may like the music in a Protestant church better than what we have, but dang, they do not have what we've got here. They do not have the real presence. They do not have the action of Christ, the high priest, offering himself to the Heavenly Father. And you are really missing something. You're missing everything if you don't have that. It may not be politically correct to say, but dang it, it's true. And it's affirmed right here. No other action of the church can equal its efficacy by the same title and to the same degree. Yeah, and the other ways of praying are great. Pray the rosary, walk the Stations of the Cross, make a retreat, novena, do the devotions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all great stuff. But the Mass is first and foremost. And all the other devotions of the church are supposed to lead up to the Mass, not take the place of the Mass. That was one of the problems we had, I think, before the council, is that, you see a lot of people praying a rosary during Mass. You see a lot of people walking the stages of the cross during Mass. And that was the big thing that St. Pius X, when he first started the liturgical reforms in the early 20th century, he said, don't pray during Mass, pray the Mass. He said the primary and indispensable source of the true Christian spirit is derived from the intelligent participation in the sacred mysteries of the church. We had our own in St. Louis here, the great Monsignor Martin Hellriegel at Holy Cross Parish, who was one of the world's foremost liturgists in his day. And in the true sense, I mean, the word liturgist has taken on a bad meaning in recent times because liturgists tend to be people who nitpick over nothing and do all kinds of silly things. The monk priest, if a guy's known to be a liturgist, it's like, it's not a good thing. But he was a liturgist in the real sense, that he understood the real place of the liturgy. Sadly, what happened in many places after the council was the liturgy committee became like a troupe of people putting on a show, and they were all into banners and balloons and all kinds of ridiculous nonsense, really. I remember right after, like 2 weeks after I was ordained, we were invited down to the Chancery office on Lincoln at the time, the CYC office, not just the sports, but like the teenagers and that kind of thing. Because we were all the young priests, we're going to be working with the teenagers, so they wanted us to connect with the office down there. And I remember walking in, and there was a sweet young thing, about 16 years old, working the desk. I said, I'm Father Myers, I'm here for the meeting. Oh, yes, yes. And I said, well, where are you from? What parish are you from? Well, I'm from Holy Cross Parish in Dayton. Oh, really? Monsignor Hellriegel. She goes, you know him? I go, yeah, he's pretty world famous. I said, what's the problem? He's so old-fashioned. I go, oh, are you kidding me? He's so old-fashioned. This is a guy who was having offertory processions back in the 40s. He was having mass facing the people in the 50s. And he was written off as a crackpot by a lot of the priests because he was so radical. And now in 1979, he was so old-fashioned. The point is, he was where everybody should have been. The church was over here when he got started, and it started coming his way. And then, like 2 weeks in 1965, the two were right where, and then all of a sudden they went way over here. But Hellriegel held fast, and he understood everything that's been said here. The liturgy is the participation in the priesthood of Christ. It's not just putting on a show and dazzling people with fancy music or hip music. Remember the music we sang right after the council? Remember that Ray Rep stuff?
Oh yeah.
Sons of God, here's holy word. Yeah, right. And some of this stuff is just awful. Lily of the field, amen, amen. It was terrible stuff, actually. I remember when I was first ordained, there was who was the guy? I think it was Father Kerry Landry. He had this songbook called High God, and they had all these kids songs, and they were nice for like a bunch of little kids in a Bible study school or something. But they were singing these things at Mass. It's like, oh, please, no, this is. And they would hand out balloons, and some parishes they had. There's probably still balloons hovering in the ceiling. So some of these churches from the 1970s. But Hellriegel, he was the right word. He understood what the Mass really was all about. And he used an awful lot of Latin still, which we're supposed to be. Anyway, but that's the whole thing. You can't beat the Mass is the very apex and pinnacle of what the church is all about. I'm sure we'll see this quote from the Second Vatican Council, which has become famous, and it's a very good one, that the Sunday Masses, the summit and the font, is the mountain. This coming Sunday, we're going to have the Gospel Transfiguration, as we do it every year on the second Sunday of Lent. And it is literally the mountaintop, where the apostles beheld the glory of Christ. And because they beheld the glory of Christ on that mountaintop, they were able to go back down into the valley, where there was a demon needing to be exorcised, and the other 9 apostles couldn't do it. But because they had been with Christ on the mountaintop, they come down and the demon leaves. And that's what the Mass is supposed to be, that mountaintop experience of God. We've seen Christ in his glory, we've consumed his very body and blood, and consequently, we can go back down into the valley on Monday morning where all the demons are waiting for us. And we can deal with them now because we've been to the mountaintop. That the Sunday Mass is the summit, the mountaintop, and the font. Pardon me, that you go to this mountaintop and you are fed, literally, with the life-giving waters of refreshment and the Holy Eucharist, of course. And what is that? And we shouldn't be that way. I mean, it's not just something you do it to get out of the way. I know. When I was in St. Genevieve, there were people, and they actually said this. They stopped going to Mass at St. Gen because the pastor's Mass always took about an hour. And they would drive half an hour to this other church, and then half an hour back for a 20-minute Mass. Your time management here leaves something to be desired. Okay, fine, okay. You see all kinds of stuff like that. One of the best ones was Father Herbica, Father Ed Herbica. There were 2 Herbica brothers. Was the pastor of St. Paul's in Benton. And he had this big sign in the vestibule that faced you as you walked out of church. It said the first person to leave Mass early was Judas. He had a thing about that. And you think about it, if you just can't wait to get out of there, you're missing a lot. You're missing out. Okay. Liturgy as a source of life, 1071. As the work of Christ, liturgy is also an action of his church. Yes, obviously, Christ needs us. We are his arms and legs. We are his body. He doesn't have the same kind of body he once had when he walked the earth. Rather, we are his arms and legs. We are, his fingers and his voice. It makes the church present and manifests her as the visible sign of the communion in Christ between God and men. Yes, the church is the gate. You cannot really link up to God without the church in some way. I know there's a lot of people that try that I can leave the church out. It's me and God. I don't need the church. Yes, you do. Why did Christ establish the church if that were not the case? He didn't just give us a book and say, here, folks, see if you can figure this out. He gave us a church who gave us the book and who interprets for us what the book means and who teaches us what Christ really wants us to know. And to participate in the liturgy, which is the action by which we interact with Christ like nothing else. It empowers us to really come to know Christ. It engages the faithful in the new life of the community and involves the conscious, active, and fruitful participation of everyone. Yeah, you just don't sit there. It's not a show. It's not TV. It's not entertainment. It's something you take part in. Frankly, it's for the Mass, and especially receiving Holy Communion, is for us Catholics. But the marriage act is for husband and wife. I don't want to get too graphic here, but if you're not a participant, if you're not taking full part, if you're missing out on the whole, I almost use the word thrust, the whole focus of the thing, But it really is. It's just that life-giving of the thing. It's a loving thing. It's a life-giving thing. It's a heavenly thing. I always tell the engaged couples getting ready for marriage, we talk about sex. I say, the the world gives a kind of a caricature of what the church teaches about sex, and it's this, that sex is something dirty, therefore you avoid it as much as possible. Whereas the church teaches just the opposite. Not that sex is something dirty, it's something holy. It's holy because when it's done properly, it's the expression of love between husband and wife. And the husband and wife work with God to create new life. I mean, you can't get any holier than that. Not really. And so, because it's holy, you treat it with respect, recognizing its power. And when it's used properly, it does have the power to sanctify, making couples more perfectly one, more completely one, in a sharing of life and love, and also bringing new life into the world. It's been my experience. I haven't talked about this before, I guess, but who've actually been in the delivery room when a child was born, and it's like there were no atheists in the delivery room. I mean, you feel the hand of God. I mean, you just know there's a God, and I just think that married couples have got to have that sensation that they're in, unless they're just a bunch of dunderheads. But dang, it's that palpable thing. That the conscious, and the point is that the conscious, active, fruitful participation in the liturgy is meant to have the same experience. It's a source of life. It is something that is transforming. And again, over the years, I've had the privilege of instructing many converts, and they all say the same thing. When they went to Mass, now a lot of people come to Mass, they kind of look bored, and it's an alien experience for them. But they're the least bit open to it. It's amazing how they say, this is it. This is it. This is good. This is what it's supposed to be. And it arouses something within them. It wakes something up inside them. Because it really is an encounter with Christ. And if anybody's open to that, it's palpable. I mean, it really is. There's all kinds of stories in history of how people, just looking at the Eucharist, became believers. They didn't know what they were believing, but they knew that this is something really holy. The sacred liturgy does not exhaust the entire activity of the church. Well, no. I mean, we do other things too. But it must be preceded by evangelization, faith, and conversion, right? It's not magic. It's not, again, a show. I think what I remember, and I'm not proud of this, but I remember as a young man, especially getting into teenage, expressing the opinion that Mass was boring. I think a lot of teenagers, I think, still say that. And implicit in that was our belief that there's something wrong with the Mass. This is not very entertaining. Of course, it's not supposed to be entertaining. However, that there was something wrong with the Mass, and then all of a sudden they started changing things. They were starting to use hipper kinds of music and try to, engage the senses more and this kind of stuff. It was like, we took it as like, well, yeah, the church is admitting the Mass is boring, and we need to do something to liven it up. Well, no. Mass is not boring. If you think it is boring, it's because you're boring. It's just that simple. You don't know what's going on here. You need to be instructed. You need to hunker down and just appreciate it. I think every priest really appreciates what St. Teresa of Avila wrote. She says she loved boring sermons. And the Lord knows we've all sat through a bunch. The reason why is because, it gave her a chance to meditate and focus on other things. And if you really pay attention, she said, no matter how, even if the priest is drunk, there's always something you can get. And it really is true. They talk about there's a grace that is imparted when the gospel is proclaimed, both on the part of the hearers and the part of the speaker. If you ask any priest, he'll tell you the same story. You hear this all the time. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, Father, that's really good what you said today. Oh, what did I say? And they'll tell you something, and you go, oh, I didn't say that. I didn't say anything like that. But that's what the guy heard, and because there's an act of grace being imparted, and it really does happen. And that's if you are engaged in the church, even if the priest is boring or even if he is drunk, uh, Christ is still active there, and if you're open to it, you get something out of it. Now, sadly, in those cases, you have to be a saint to drive something out of it. But Saint Teresa was. What made her a saint? Well, going to mass and taking part. But that's the thing, because we're not. I know that in the Lutheran Church, especially, and a lot of Protestant churches, what the minister makes as a salary is contingent on how well he preaches. He's got to preach a good sermon. He's got to be entertaining. He's got to be topical. He's got to be pithy. And if he can even squeeze in some authentic religion, that would be a plus. But that's because their whole service is the service of the Word. They don't have sacraments. And that's the other thing. They talk about how Catholics are ignorant of the Bible. Well, many Catholics are. However, all the Protestants, every single last one of them, is ignorant of liturgy, which is frankly much more important. Not that the Bible isn't important, but liturgy is more important. The Bible is the Word of God. The liturgy is God. That God is made present through the Holy Eucharist and Mass. And, you come to know Christ, specifically, not just about Him, but to know Him by the active and intelligent participation in the mysteries of the Church. How it is. And which is why the Catholic Church produces saints, people who are canonizable. There's a lot of good Lutherans, a lot of good Baptists, a lot of good Muslims too, I guess, But it's we're the ones that produce saints. In the year 2000, there were all kinds of surveys. They asked people who was the greatest football player, the all-time best baseball player, and all this other kind of, And I think it was Stanford University that had a survey. They asked all kinds of scholars, historians, people who do this stuff, to identify the 40 top forces for good, the people who, in the last 1,000 years, cast the greatest shadow for good in the world. And they came up with 40 names, and something like 30 of them were canonized Catholic saints. Like Francis of Assisi, John Paul II, people like that. That wasn't 30, it was like 25. Well, okay, only 60% instead of 75%. And they threw in people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and that kind of thing. But that the world recognizes. And where do these guys get their holiness? It wasn't from going to tent meetings. It was from the Eucharist, from the liturgy, taking part. It has the power to make us holy, and that's why if you consciously and willingly absent yourself from Sunday Mass on a regular basis, you're committing serious sin because of what you're cutting yourself off from. It's not that your backside didn't occupy a certain, 400 square inches or something. It's because of what was going on there, and you couldn't have cared less. You just simply could not have cared less. That the Mass is for us, again, what St. Peter experienced at the Mount of the Transfiguration. Lord, it is good that we are here. Let's build some tents and let's make the experience last. It's amazing how I know of priests who are missionaries to Africa. The average Mass in Africa lasts 3 hours, and nobody and people are reluctant to go home when it's over. And you'll find that true in India and all the other parts of the world where people are really engaged in what's going on. And you do find that among the poor mostly, because people come to some of our inner cities churches and they well, the sign of peace lasts 45 minutes. I don't know if you've ever been to everybody's shaking hands with everybody else, but if the sermon goes 45 minutes, nobody complains. Yeah. They understand what's going on here, and it's a big difference. I know when I was a kid, I used to go to my grandparents lived upstairs in a two-family flat, and I always went to my grandparents to the 5:30 Sunday morning Mass. And my grandpa always got there at 5 o'clock so he could get the last pew.
Well, that doesn't happen here.
Oh, no. Never. course, Monsignor McCune always had the mass, and he always gave a 25-minute sermon, but the rest of the mass was only 7 minutes. So we got out of there pretty fast, And Grandpa got it out of the way. I did my duty. I did, but it's that kind of attitude that the church tried to address at the Vatican Council, and that's what people like Elrigo spent their whole lives, trying to fight against the idea that you really should love to be here. I've used this story before, but it's still true. If I have a Saturday afternoon mass, or wedding rather, especially to go a little bit late. At the reception, I'll get at least 15 people who will say, "Hey, Father, do we gotta go to mass tomorrow?" You get to go to no. You gotta go. You get to go to. No, you gotta. That's the attitude that's got to change. And finally, the guy's wife says, "Oh, Bill, what do you say?" He says, Anyway, I'm always edified by the people, the daily mass crowd. These are the hardcore ones, especially the ones that come for the Feast of St. Stephen on the day after Christmas, or the Monday of Easter week. They have to go into all that stuff. They're still here on Monday morning. This is great. Can't get enough. And that's true. It's a wonderful thing. Every parish I've ever been at, the daily mass crowd always forms a sub-community. They all know each other, and they all interact with each other. And it's just, and if somebody doesn't show up, it's like, hey, what happened to stuff? Great stuff. Great stuff. Okay. 1073, the liturgy is also a participation in Christ's own prayer addressed to the Father and the Holy Spirit. In the liturgy, all Christian prayer finds its source and goal. Yeah, this is all the other prayers are supposed to flow from this, just like the devotional life of the church. And that's the other thing. People have lamented the demise of devotions. The devotional life of the church isn't what it used to be. And that in itself is not a bad thing so much because of, the Eucharist and the Mass is supposed to be paramount. But the whole idea is that the Mass is supposed to lead to that kind of stuff, and that kind of stuff is supposed to lead back to the Mass. And I think it's not just that. The fact that people aren't engaged in the devotional life of the church like they used to be, I think is more a sign of just indifference rather than, of placing emphasis where it belongs. I think it's indifference. I know when I was a kid, I grew up in the South, right off the South Grand, and there was a streetcar that every Tuesday had Rock Church, right on, this is where instead of Del Mar and Union, it was Rock Church. They had a special streetcar line for the
Rock. The only place that had professional devotion.
Yeah.
At that time.
Yeah.
The parishes didn't have it. We used to go to Tuesday night.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah. But it was that much of a thing. And it wasn't obviously going to the PH devotions. Oh, well. In the liturgy, all Christians, through the liturgy, the inner man is rooted and grounded in the great love with which the Father loved us, in his beloved Son. It is the same marvelous work of God that is lived and internalized by all prayer at all times in the Holy Spirit. Thank you, St. Paul, writing to the Ephesians. That's what he's talking about. And, should we be praying? Of course we should be praying. We should be praying every way we can pray, but realizing that if you leave Mass out of that, you're just not, you're missing out. It's a big part. It's like having a wonderful car with no tires, or no engine, probably better analogy. It looks great. You get a bunch of people to push you around, or you just go downhill all the time. But you get to the bottom, you're going to be in trouble. In the same marvelous Catechism and Liturgy, 1074. The liturgy is the summit toward which the activity of the church is directed. It is also the font from which all her power flows. Okay, I knew we'd come up with that sooner or And that's what I described. It is, when you see this, think of the mountain, think of the transfiguration, that it is the mountaintop where you experience God. And you go back down the valley, empowered, invigorated, sanctified, enlightened, whatever, all those things. And it is therefore the privileged place for catechizing the people of God. Yeah, and the Council of Trent dictated that the Sunday sermon is the primary teaching office of the Catholic Church. Um, Back in the 1950s, they had a program in the Archdiocese here. What was it called? It was called I had a name for it. Anyway, but every priest got a booklet, and it got an outline of what every Sunday what they're supposed to talk about, and it was just covering the whole catechism. And what a bad idea! In fact, I may start doing that just for that reason. That's why we have a Catechism Class here. But I'm glad you all come. There should be a few thousand more people here. Um, the whole understanding is that this is the primary teaching device of the church, and it is for teaching. If you look historically, whenever the life of the church is at its lowest ebb, it's because of lousy teaching. The gospel isn't being taught because the priests don't know it. They're badly instructed themselves, or people just don't give a flying hoot or whatever. But it's always a crisis of education. But there's something about the gospel when it really is preached by in its truth and well, it really changes people. And like I say, the Sunday sermon is supposed to satisfy that. I think a lot of Catholics today don't know, and it's embarrassing. One of their Protestant friends will argue religion, will say, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, go ask Father; he'll tell you." You should know yourself, at least something. Um, yeah, I mean, I have a degree in theology, but still in all. No, I think I've told this story before, but Monsignor Ronald Knox, who reinstituted the College of Catholic Studies at Oxford back in the 30s or 20s, said he had never seen such well-indoctrinated Catholic laymen as the American GIs who were there in the 1940s. From the Baltimore Catechism. The Catechism taught them the faith. They memorized it, they knew it, they believed it, and they practiced it. And that's kind of how it's supposed to go. Catechesis is intrinsically linked with the whole of liturgical and sacramental activity, for it is in the sacraments, especially in the Eucharist, that Christ Jesus works in fullness for the transformation of men. Because we are learning not about Jesus so much as we are coming to know the person of Jesus Christ. And that tells all the difference in the world. There's a great story. I'm trying to think the name of the guy now. There was back in the 30s, there was a priest. He was a priest, but he's also a concert pianist. I think his name was Père Monsieur. And he had been instructed by some of the great composers of the 19th century. And he had a great nephew that was getting ready for a concert. He was trying to walk in the family footsteps. And he was playing a piece by, I always get Schumann and Schubert mixed up and backwards. Whoever, I'll say Schubert, but put it as Schumann, whoever. And he's practicing this piece, and he's playing it for his uncle. And he comes to a part where he pauses, and then he starts playing again. And the uncle is he's an old man by this time, his 80s or 90s. All of a sudden, he hears the pause and goes, and he comes up and he almost takes the kid's fingers off, slams the lid down the keys. What? He said, there is no pause there. But my teacher said, in the book, the text says there's a pause. He said, there is no pause. He said, but uncle, it's there. It's a pause there. He says, look, when I when Schumann wrote that piece, there was no pause. When he taught it to Schubert, there was no pause. And when Schubert taught it to me, there was no pause. There is no pause. In other words, you may have the text in front of you, but he knew the guys, and the guys, they said, no pause. Okay. And that's kind of what the liturgy is. It's like, yeah, we know what the text says, but hey, you got it straight from the horse's mouth, the man himself, which is, in this case, Jesus Christ. 1075, liturgical catechesis aims to initiate people into the mysteries of Christ. It is mystagogy. Mystagogy means the instruction of the faithful. That's a term we use mostly in the RCIA program for the sessions we have after the people are baptized and confirmed to make their first communion. They're eased into the church. They're already Catholics at this point, but it's the instruction of people who already believe and are, one with us. So mystagogy is the further instruction of people who are, trying to get as close to Christ as possible. The definition of theology is faith seeking understanding, fide querens intellectum. And I got the faith, I have this relationship with Christ, I want to know more. And that's really what theology is, and that's what the liturgy is essential to that. By proceeding from the visible to the invisible, from the sign to the thing signified, from the sacraments to the mysteries. Yeah. We see these things, we experience them, they engage our senses, and they're supposed to communicate something beyond themselves, and that is the mystery of Christ himself. Such catechesis is to be presented by local and regional catechisms. This catechism, which aims to serve the whole church in all the diversity of her rites and cultures, will present what is fundamental and common to the whole church in the liturgy as a mystery and the celebration, section 1, and then the 7 sacraments and the sacramentals, section 2. So the elements is what we're going to get into. Like I say, the first part is kind of esoteric, but we'll get through it. Okay, any questions about that? Any disputations? Really?
The saints.
Yeah.
Catholics are the only ones that have saints. And do the Protestants recognize any of those people?
Yeah, you'll see a St. Thomas Lutheran Church occasionally, because he's an apostle, but they don't have anywhere near the Orthodox will have a canonization process which is similar to ours. They'll recognize people as saints that we don't. Not that we say they're not saints, we just don't recognize them as saints. They knew them better than we did. There's just about every other Russian male is named Vladimir, because Saint Vladimir was a very popular saint among the Russians. He's not so big in the West, but just in terms of just personal sanctity, name anybody in the last 100 years who was looked upon as being holy, and the world was acclaimed as being holy. You might get somebody like the Dalai Lama, or Martin Luther King, but by and large, it's all Catholics, Mother Teresa, and Pope John Paul, etc., etc., etc. And the church, we really do, because that's part of the creed, the communion of saints, faith, not just here on earth, but also the ones that went before us and clear the path for us. Big part of our faith. Striving, we want to be in that number where the saints go marching in.
Amen.
The catechism is getting better.
I think so. I really think. I think the young priests coming out of Kendrick now and other seminaries are better instructed than we were. I say that humbly. When I was at Kendrick, there were like the spiritual theology department was one man. The moral theology department was one man. You only got one point of view, and you only got what he thought was important. And I got out of Kendrick and found out, man, there's some gaps here, some lacunae, a fancy word. Just, we never talked. We never had this. We never talked. We should have been taught this, but we never would have. But I think the men coming out of Canada are better form. I think so. We were smarter than they are. Our natural, better looking too. Oh yeah, you would say that. But no, I think there's always great optimism for the church, and again, we have a history that goes back 2,000 years, and the darkest days, it's like the old saying that the darkest hours of the night come right before the dawn, and we're due for a glorious dawn. To be honest with you, but it's always been that way. It's always been that way. The church has always had a remarkable ability to reform herself. Protestants talk about they're embarrassing, downright embarrassing things in our history. And we survived all that stuff. That's the point, not the fact that these bad things happened. It's that we survived it and got better. We're not dead. It's like somebody gets a terrible disease and people die. We didn't die. We recovered from that. And like coming back from COVID. And we're stronger now. We're immune and we're charging on.
I think it's amazing that for generations and generations before Christ came, everybody believed in supernatural. And yet there's so many atheists in the world.
And you know what the cause of that is? Science. Science. And the stupidest people out there are the scientists. When confronted with real science, they balk. This whole thing about Darwin's theory, for example, it's still a theory. It's never been proven. People take it as if it's a fact, but it's still a theory that has never proven itself. And there's no proof in this fossil record. They keep saying, well, we're going to find it someday. Yeah, right. When pigs are going to start growing wings and flying someday, which of course would be a Darwinian thing. But you talk to anybody who's a Darwinist, and they always use the language of intelligent design. Why does a giraffe have a long neck? Well, so that it can reach the leaves. Now wait a minute. Nature doesn't care whether giraffes can reach those leaves or not. There was somebody who really cared about giraffes who made the giraffe's neck longer, that they could reach the leaves up there. It doesn't happen by random chance. It can't happen by random chance. But that's what they'll tell you. So there is an intelligent designer out there. And if you talk about intelligent design on any campus in this country, except maybe a couple of Catholic universities, they'll throw you out. They'll take away your tenure. You're gone. But no, they use science as a way of getting around believing in God. And, I knew a guy once who was I heard of a guy. He was a missionary to Africa. He was a physician, and there was a tribe that was about to go extinct because they had such a poor diet. And he understood this, and he taught them, no, eat this, don't eat that. And he saved the community, and they thought he walked on water. He was the guy. And whatever he told them, they believed, But there were two things that he told them that they couldn't believe. One was that there were women in the civilized country that actually murdered their own children. They couldn't believe that. How could a mother know that? They can't have it. People killing their own children? No, that this doesn't happen. And then there's people who don't believe in God. I thought it was interesting, their take on that was that these people obviously haven't seen an ocean or a mountain range. And if they just saw one of these, they would know that there's a God. Oh, an interesting take on it. But you got to be educated not to believe in God, because it is the natural thing. I mean, if you look at this world, this universe, for crying out loud, it doesn't bring you to the Hubble telescope, for crying out loud. something going on here. Yeah. Or you can use a microscope and look at a single cell. And say, look all that stuff that's in there. Why not? And I got billions of these things. They all work together. Oh my Lord. And I can produce another being just like myself. Holy cow. And if this thing gets hurt, it heals itself. Oh my Lord. All these things are proofs of God. People die. That's the so-called enlightenment. And it's just a way of thumbing your nose at God. That's all it is. And where the Catholic brain gets see that obviously there's a God.
Well, I think they would tell you it's because they don't, it's things they don't understand, like back in the day they worshiped the sun because they had no knowledge of it. That's why they consider them God.
But most people realized that, the sun is obviously bigger and more powerful than I am. But at the same time, they realized that there's a power beyond the sun. That someone who can make a sun. Now that's the guy you really want to, worship. I think most ancient people realized that there was a power beyond the sun or beyond the mountains or volcanoes or whoever. Like the story of the guy who went into a grocery store to buy some salt. And God said, "You have any salt?" Salt? Do I have salt? I'll show you. He takes him down to the basement. He has barrels of rock salt and grain salt and iodized salt. And he's got barrels and barrels and barrels and barrels of salt and salt and salt. He said, "Man, you must be a heck of a salt salesman to sell all this salt." He said, "Me? No, I can't sell salt at all. The guy who sold me this, he could sell salt." And it's kind of it, you look at the sun, it's powerful, but who made that? That's the guy you want to get to know. And so, I'll leave you with that. 2 weeks, folks, 2 weeks. I hope you folks at home got that.
I got you have a little mini